All right, so this is part three, and this will wrap it up. Before I get started, I want to do a promo for the greatest place I have ever stayed as far as hospitality, ambiance. It's Shack Up Inn in Clarksdale, Mississippi, not far at all from the legendary Crossroads, which is the famously known place where Robert supposedly made the deal with the devil. Now that's debatable. There are some other areas, so you just have to go and find out yourself. But they're really great, and they have some really awesome places. This is actually the back area, and we had a kind of apartment hotel room upstairs, and this is what you saw on the balcony. And a balcony. We stayed in one of the cabins, which are some of the old row houses that they used in the cotton field. So they've really gone out of their way to give the ambiance. Now it looks rough, but on the inside it's got everything you need, AC and what have you. You're also just a stone's throw away from Morgan Freeman's club, Ground Zero, and they're actually going to be opening one here in Biloxi soon. And all this is not far at all from Memphis. So, if you're coming to Memphis, definitely make your way here, because it's no point coming to the great Sun Studios and Bill Street and not seeing where it really all began. You can call ahead. The state of Mississippi has really gone above and beyond to promote the state in the Blues Trail. So you can get anything you need simply by going online. You can type in Mississippi Blues Trail. You can type in Greenville, Clarksdale. Just type in Delta Blues, and it will get you there. And they will send you out everything you need. They were a big help for me. So I can't thank the state of Mississippi and the wonderful people at Shack Up Inn and Clarksdale and Greenwood. Greenwood, by the way, the name of the little small cabins there is Tallahatchie Flats, because it's not that far from Tallahatchie Bridge, which, as you know, Bobby Gentry was from Greenwood, Mississippi. She did Ode to Billy Joe, so as well as some other songs. So just a little fun fact there. And you can also learn a lot about the civil rights movement and what really started it all with the death of a young Emmett Till there in Greenwood. Now, how I got started is I was living and working in Ridgeland, Mississippi, just south of Jackson. And I was a manager of a retirement community, and there was a resident that lived there, a black lady, an elderly lady, but she was very young-spirited. And one day, as I was pouring coffee for breakfast, she said, "John, have you ever been to a juke joint?" Well, I knew what a juke joint was. I remember the first time hearing what a juke joint was, the quintessential cross the train tracks, which, by the way, in many ways is true, was through a TV movie about Elvis when I was a kid. But she said, if you haven't been to a juke joint, you need to go to the Delta. Well, the Delta's not that far from Ridgeland, so we made a weekend of it. And the first juke joint I ever went to, the authentic one, is Red's, and this is a picture of it. And Red, you got to meet Red. If you don't meet anybody in the Delta, Red, to me, is as authentic as they get. And luckily, while I was there, I just happened to be at the right place at the right time to meet the legendary Leo Bud Welch. I say legendary. The story about him is really unique. He was somewhat of a best-kept secret of the Delta area, but he is definitely one of the last true Delta blues musicians, and many people didn't even know. And this is how I would end up finding out that Jimbo Mathis from the Squirrel Nut Zippers was from the Mississippi area, because he helped do this album. I was so shocked they actually had vinyl, and Leo was nice enough to autograph it. He's since passed away, but he had a very interesting latter years. If you had to live out your life and go out with a bang, Leo did it. And the story of his manager he's a veteran, great guy. I encourage you to look it up on YouTube and find out more about Leo Bud Welch. You can also hear his music, but the story is fantastic. Something else I didn't know, Dorothy Moore, who you may remember from Misty Blue, she's from the Mississippi area. So that's how we ended up in the Delta, is by going to find that juke joint. And when we found the juke joint, we found out that's where the Crossroads was, and one thing led to another, and I was hooked, and we go back quite frequently. In Mobile, Alabama, where I'm from, I remember first seeing B.B. King at, it was at a Bay Fest. I want to say it was the first one, I may be wrong, but I do remember it was his 80th birthday. And he put on just a fantastic show. I did not get to see him at the Sanger Theater, but I grabbed the flyer back then, and this is the 1990s. But Snook Seaglin. But BB was a very humble guy. To see him live, to be the king of the blues was amazing. While we were living in Ridgeland, unfortunately, BB passed away. And we had actually sent for information about the museum there in Indianola, where he's from, and then he passed away. So we made the trip to his museum, where they had his body laid for viewing. This is the guitar. It's a replica that's outside the museum. Where he was laid to rest is actually the remaining parts of a cotton gin that he worked at as a young boy. And these are the ribbons and all. It was a really rainy day that day. And while we were out and about, we drove by the Club Ebony, it's a club that BB owned for a while. So back in the heyday, he'd come back to town, he'd play there. He was very proud of his roots. And so that's why it was important to him to be buried back in his hometown. And you can visit his grave there at the B.B. King Museum. It's a wonderful museum. Now we're going to make our way over to the finale. As I said, we've been trying to collect mementos and try to put people as close as possible to the life and times of Robert Johnson. This is an authentic poster, Blues on Tour. This is Robert Lockwood. Now, I'll tell you the story of Robert shortly, but if you'll notice the people he was with, the Pinetop Perkins, Little Milton, Bobby Rush, Little Ed, Ike Turner, Alvin Youngblood. I mean, it's just amazing, the people, and they were touring Muddy Waters Blues Band, Tower City Amphitheater. So, it's pretty landmark. Now, the reason Robert is at the top is anybody who knows about blues, they know their John Lee Hooker. This is an original album. I just wanted it out there for example. But if they know their blues and they know the Delta, they know the significance of Robert Lockwood as well as Johnny Shines. Now, Robert Lockwood, his mother, I believe, dated Robert for a while. And Robert did not teach anyone to play guitar, but he did teach Robert Lockwood. And so Robert kind of viewed Robert, they called him Robert Jr., but he viewed Robert Johnson as a mentor, almost like a father figure. And he plays remarkably like Robert Johnson. He has one song that he claims that Robert wrote and performed but never recorded it, and he remembered it. And it's called Down Child. And I tend to believe him because the style, the wording, it just sounds like Robert. So it's really eerie. If you get a chance, look it up. It's Robert Lockwood Jr. doing Down Child. So that's the significance of Robert Lockwood. And of course, he's got his own music, does his own thing. Now everything's about Robert Johnson. Johnny Shines is a gentleman that traveled with Robert. He was introduced by a piano player. Now Johnny could not remember his name. He knew his nickname. I'm not going to give that away because I think I have narrowed down who it was that introduced him and Robert. But he and Robert traveled quite extensively and played, not together really, because Robert was a loner. But they traveled a lot, and then Robert would disappear. So he probably spent more time with Robert Johnson than anyone else. If you get a chance, is standing at the Crossroads is eerily awesome album because he sounds like he could be Robert Johnson himself. I don't see how anyone could play that remarkably similar to Robert without having literally heard him quite often, which Johnny did. So Johnny was a wealth of knowledge in learning the true story of Robert Johnson. Here we have, this is the Mount Zion Church. This is in Greenwood. This is a church outside of where Robert is buried. And this is thought to be the most likely location. There's a couple of them, but this one has a witness who was the wife of the caretaker. You'll see the handwritten letter that Robert wrote on his deathbed, where he declares that he knows that Jesus of Nazareth, King of Jerusalem, he knows that my Redeemer liveth and that he will call me from the grave. So there goes the myth. So one morning I woke up to walk the dog. It's about 8:30 in the morning. And over to the right side, in the back is the river. And there's a cotton field, and then there's just a set of windbreaker trees. So I walked the dog back behind there along the river. And as I did, I came across this steeple that was almost directly behind the church, just right before you got to it. So one would assume that came off of this. Perhaps it was the original steeple and it was knocked down by a storm, what have you. So as I get there, the grass is still wet. One thing I noticed, and I would later find out the story behind it, but when you're walking through the cemetery, there's very few markers. Robert's is really one of the few, if not only one, in the back underneath the tree. And as I'm walking, I noticed that the ground is uneven. It's like molehills. I would later find out that the cemetery for Mount Zion, at the time, back in the 30s, was the only African-American cemetery there. So a lot of times you had cases where they were buried 2, 3 to a grave. They would bury the first one deep and then just bury them up. So that was the reason why. It was really tragic. But this is cotton that would have come from the cotton field that was on between the Tallahatchie Flats where I was staying and Mount Zion. The piece of wood that you see there was laying on the ground right next to the steeple. So I took it as a memento. But it's a very interesting place. I would definitely encourage you to go right across the street from Mount Zion. You can actually see the corner of Baptist-town across this field about a half mile. It's wide open cotton field, so it's very easy to see. And there's an old AM blues radio station. It's been there forever, right out in the middle of the field. Okay, this is the two legends themselves, Robert Lockwood, Johnny Shines. This album came out in 1980, and it was, pretty landmark to have the legends themselves together, but so much history between the two of them. And this was a promotional copy that would have been sent out, and this one was one of the first promotionals because it would have had a press release. So, of course, this being 1980, that's why you have it typed on a typewriter. Rounder Records were the ones that did it. So it's pretty neat to have the two legends together. They did perform several times together. They were good friends. So it wasn't unusual to see them work together. Now, I haven't listened to this album. I understand this one's different than the earlier one by Johnny Shines, which again, I encourage you to listen to because it just sounds almost eerily like Robert himself. This is a piece of folk art that is made from the side wood of an old row house. They've taken 2 railroad tie nails and barbed wire and made it into folk art. So I couldn't pass up the chance to get some Americana. Thought that was pretty neat. And that is pretty much the Robert Johnson Connection collection as it is now. And I'm sure it will hopefully keep growing as I find more items. One more thing I do want to show you. I got this poster in 2007 when this movie came out. I'm a big fan of the director, and I like Samuel L. Jackson. Plus, it had a lot to do with the blues. I'm actually working on the history of the song Stacko Lee, which it would become Stagger Lee. And there's quite a bit of history to the story. The term bucket of blood and Black Snake Moan, they do have origins going back quite a ways. But the interesting thing about this movie, and I found this out in the last year, if you've seen the movie, you know that Samuel L. Jackson does a very risque version of Stagger Lee, and it's got a lot of profanity in it, but he does a really good job, has a good voice, and it makes it an interesting version of Stagger Lee. Well, in doing some research, I found out that was pretty much stolen from R.L. Burnside. He had done impromptu, I guess, kind of improv version of Stagger Lee at a juke joint, and somebody happened to record him. And when you listen to it, it is almost word for word exactly the same way. So it becomes really apparent that that's where they got it from. Now, I don't recall seeing them give credit to R.L. Burnside on that. So, and I'm not sure if they have done so, but it's definitely R.L. Burnside. It's definitely a version that is original compared to that one. So, a little fun fact, if you get a chance, just look that up. It's Stagger Lee, R.L. Burnside. Okay, so that is the Robert Johnson Connection Collection. I hope you've enjoyed this long, somewhat tedious explanation, and I will keep everyone up to date as I add more items. Everyone have a wonderful day.